Adults of Reddit born prior to 1980, do you remember the Chernobyl disaster? What were you doing, and what was your reaction upon learning what happened? I was in the 5th grade, and I remember learning about it on the evening news with my parents, likely several days or weeks after it happened, and being very worried it would start a nuclear war. I basically thought pretty much everyone in Russia was dead, or was going to die, and we were next. So, I put all of my treasures in my backpack, and carried them around with me for the next several days waiting for the bombs to fall. Also, I lived in a house with a bomb shelter which just fueled the imagination of my nuclear panic. So obviously I hid granola bars in there. When they didn't, over time I became terribly worried about all the animals that were mutated, and that all of the fruits and vegetables that were all contaminated with fallout. Anytime I saw fruits or vegetables that had weird shapes, I thought they were radioactive. Any oddity, like the neighbor's cross-eyed cat, I went straight to contaminated with fallout. As an adult, when I see a really odd shaped fruit I don't think, that's neat. There's still a teeny part of me that thinks it's probably radioactive. Not to further your fears, but a lot of fruit are more radioactive than other foods due to their natural uptake in potassium, which some isotopes are naturally radioactive, K40. You can actually refer to doses of radiation in terms of some fruits digested. But steady low doses of radiation have actually been known to help grow plants. The most scientific version of banana for scale. I'm a tad older than you, and still in the throes of the Cold War insert. I was terrified we were all going to die, and that the USSR had let this happen on purpose, or at the very least, that it was much worse than they were letting on. Newsflash, it was. I was a senior in high school and thought the same, that they had done it on purpose, in order to have an excuse to attack us. I had read Alas, Babylon and was ready for an attack. A few days later it rained, and the local weatherman talked about acid rain. The Russians were so secretive and that fed our paranoia. I'm American. My friend was engaged to a guy from Russia, who also lived here in the States. His mother and grandmother were still living in Kyiv. I remember him trying for around a week to get in touch with them. It was really scary and stressful, and I remember his tears of relief when he finally spoke with his mother. She was okay, his gran was okay. They never left, and were far enough away from ground zero that they just stayed there. How'd he get out of the Soviet Union? He joined the Israeli army and defected. I was born in 1982, in Moscow, Russia. My mom and grandma were both biologists. My mom worked at an institute specializing in biowarfare. Grandma was doing cancer research, and were on the train from Kyiv, Ukraine back to Moscow, when the explosion happened. The gov flat out lied to people and nobody found out until later. I recall videos of hundreds of buses of people from Ukraine evacuating into Moscow. Back then it was part of the USSR. After that, my dad carried a Geiger counter everywhere we went, checking all the produce for radiation. We had acid rains, so everybody was told to walk with an umbrella. My mom once wore blue socks and the rain stained her feet blue from the acidity. We were told that walking in the rain would cause baldness. I worked with an engineer from Kyiv that was bald. He said that they were offering a full day of pay for 1 hour of work at the road barricades, measuring and recording the radiation of all the vehicles going in and out. He said he did that for a couple of weeks. One day, it rained. All his hair fell out. He is still bald. Great guy and excellent engineer. He also has some crazy stories about he and his wife and son packing backpacks to leave the country, illegally, and the arguments over what to take, and the escape itself. Really eye-opening stuff to my fresh out of university Canadian mind. Cool story. I'm glad he made it out. I never thought about that. Escaping a bad place, and which of one's possessions do you take? Photos, heirlooms, food, and water, clothes, family members. I have trouble deciding what to take for an overpass stay. Both sides of my grandparents had to flee the country because of war and other bad stuff. From what I was told, my dad's side had to leave everything behind, restarted their life in a foreign place with just their clothes on their back, and a few coins that was hidden in my father's swaddle, since he was an infant at that time. Everything else was confiscated or stolen. My mom's side was a bit lucky because they were in the military, so the military took care of them mostly, but war is war. They still had to leave almost everything behind and had to get out as fast as they can while they still can. So yeah, you know, people always talk about their heritage and things passed down for generations. I got none of that. My grandparents are all passed now, so all I have left are maybe a few pictures that they somehow snuck out with all the chaos they've been through. That's it. Not that I care about they didn't leave me any fortune/heirloom. I care about I know nothing about my ancestry. I can't even find records of anybody that I can trace back to since most of the records are probably destroyed by wars. It's kinda sad. I remember it. I'm in Australia and thought it was so far away it would not really affect us here. I'm even old enough to recall 3 Mile Island, so Chernobyl wasn't a huge shock after that. Except that 3 Mile Island was a partial meltdown because of a combination human error and stuck valve led to the accidental release of coolant. Nobody was killed, and Harrisburg hasn't seen an increase in cancer following it. What it did do was crystallize fears of nuclear power, which was already under attack. Arguably, this hastened global warming. Meanwhile, more nuclear material is released in the atmosphere by your average coal-fired plant each year. Not me, but my parents. We live in Croatia, which is not that far from Chernobyl. I asked them what it was like during that time. They said that they did not even knew that it happened at first. It only came out in public like 10 days later because the Soviets tried to cover it up. The moment that the rest of the Europe found out about it, they immediately said on all TV stations that they must wash every piece of vegetables, fruit or any kind of food to great extent, and that they advised to stay in houses if they do not need to be outside. Not long ago my parents had some really stupid political discussion about our country and I just said so. The effects of Chernobyl are finally kicking in, eh? I'm from Czech Republic and my dad told me the same. Basically had no idea until 10 days later. People started taking iodine supplements to prevent damage of the thyroid gland. I'm not sure about the specifics, but I remember iodine and thyroid gland. Also, I heard some rumors about children being born with some defects at the time, but that's mostly anecdotal, and I'm not sure if it wasn't just a hoax. Potassium iodide is a quick way of supplying your body with iodine, particularly your thyroid gland, by providing readily available and not radioactive iodine as a preventative measure. You can decrease the amount of iodine 131 absorbed, which is a common radioactive isotope released by uranium and plutonium fission reaction. I-131 is a major health hazard due to its radioactivity, its tendency to accumulate in the thyroid, and just how much is released by nuclear disasters. By flooding your body with iodine that is not radioactive, you make it much more difficult for your body to absorb the iodine that is radioactive, decreasing your risk of complications such as thyroid cancer. It won't protect you from radiation sickness or cancer risk from other sources, but it's a cheap and easy way to lessen your risk of thyroid cancer, so it's worth a shot if you're going to be exposed to fallout or fission products. This was a great explanation. Thanks. Not me, but my wife. She was working with radioactive substances at the time in London, and the delicately precise experiments weren't coming out as they should have done, and they couldn't figure out why not. This was before the Soviet government released the whole truth, of course. More chillingly, shortly after the disaster, her research institute hosted a couple of scientists from Kyiv. They said they'd been told there'd been a minor accident, nothing to worry about, and they knew it was total bullshit, because all their radiation badges had suddenly gone completely black. In Sweden the reactor workers are only scanned coming out of the tractor, but at the time a reactor worker was living in his summer cottage, but without running water, so he used the washrooms at his work. But to get to it, he had to go in the building and then double back to get to where he wanted, but doing so he passed the scanners, and alarmed that he was contaminated. They were very confused checking everything but came to the conclusion that somewhere in the Eastern Bloc something has happened. It might have been how it was presented here, but we were told that we were the first ones to know. Yeah. Also once Force Mark knew it was something external, Sweden sent up a few planes from the Air Force zigzagging over the Baltic Sea as close to the Soviet Union as possible to trace the fallout, coming to the conclusion that something had happened over there. I'm from Czech Republic. Back then it was still Czechoslovakia. I wasn't born yet, but my mom has a story. My mom was in the 1st of May parade, a communist thing, where many people had to walk with flags throughout the entire town. Those clouds were in the sky, it was raining a bit. Nobody told them anything, that happened, that it may be harmful to walk outside. It's crazy when you think about it now with all the precautions, but I guess nobody wanted to ruin the 1st of May celebrations upcoming, the day when you celebrate work. Austrian here, born in 1983. One of my father's friends was in an army maneuver when the radioactive dirt rained down on them. The army most likely knew about it, but didn't care enough to protect their own soldiers. My father's friend died of cancer in the early 1990s. Also, a neighbor of us was jogging in the radioactive rain. He lost all his hair in the weeks afterwards, and it never grew back. As for myself, all I remember is that we had to take iodine tablets 4 years afterwards. They were regularly given to us in kindergarten and later in primary school. The commies didn't tell anyone about their little mishap. Only when the radioactive cloud was detected by other countries and satellite pictures revealed the blown off rooftop of the reactor building, they were practically forced to make a statement. Like and sub please.